Charlie! Lola? Charlie! Charlie and Lola! I'm just not keen on spiders.
I have this little sister Lola. She is small and very funny. One day I asked her, "Why aren't you brushing your teeth in the bathroom, Lola?" And she said,
There's a big hairy spider in the sink.
Lola doesn't like spiders. I always have to catch them and put them outside for her. Would you like me to move the spider, Lola?
Yes, please, Charlie.
There's nothing to be scared of. Spiders are fine.
I'm not scared, Charlie. Spiders just make me feel all yucky. So can you move him?
OK, Lola. The best way to catch a spider is to carefully put a plastic cup over it, then slide a card underneath so it can't escape.
Catch him, Charlie, and put him outside.
If I can catch him, I'll put him outside. But then they always come back up the drain pipe.
That's why I don't like them, Charlie. They're always going up the walls. They're always dangling and running about. Sometimes they're up there. And then they're right here. They run this way. And that way. You never know what they're going to be up to next. I don't like you.
They can run in all directions, Lola, because they've got 8 legs. And each leg has 7 knees.
They must have a lot of knees, Charlie.
They do. And that's why they can run and move all over the place.
But I still don't like them. And they're big and they're hairy.
Well, this one isn't big or hairy. Some are, and you've got to be careful of those ones. But none of them, not even one, is as big and hairy as you, Lola. Just think how big and hairy you would look to a spider.
I never thought of that.
And he's only a teeny-weeny house spider. He can't hurt you.
I still don't like him very much.
So I said, do you remember there was a time when you didn't like worms, Lola?
Yes, but then Dad told me worms were very good for gardens. They dig up all the soil, which helps flowers to grow. See? I like worms, Charlie.
Yes, but you also didn't like caterpillars, did you?
Yes, but Charlie, caterpillars eat green things like lettuce, which is really good because I don't like lettuce. And caterpillars are the most best creepy crawlies because when they become old, they turn into butterflies, you see. And then they're not creepy crawlies at all.
And there was a time when you didn't even like beetles.
Oh, really? Because I can't remember ever not liking beetles. Because they're so funny. They get stuck on their back and wiggle their funny little legs.
Got him.
So you see, I like creepy crawlies. I'm just not keen on spiders.
So I told Lola, spiders are just the same as other creepy crawlies. They have a little life and they have their little jobs. Oh, and they're really, really clever. Look, they can walk upside down. See?
That is clever, Charlie.
Would you like to hold the cup and card, Lola? There's really nothing to be scared of. He's a harmless spider, aren't you?
Okay.
See? He's really nice.
Hello. Charlie, it's moving!
Hold still, Lola.
Ah!
Oh, now we're going to have to find him all over again. Lola, which way did he go?
Can you see him yet, Charlie?
Not yet. You better stay there. Here's Spider.
I'm not scared, Charlie. I know it's not big or hairy, and it can walk upside down, which is really clever. And he's got lots of knees. I just don't like spiders, Charlie. And I don't like those webby things either. Ugh. They get stuck on your face and they're all dirty.
You couldn't be more wrong. Spiders make spider webs, which catch flies and help keep the house tidy. They're so clever because if you look closely, you'll see spider webs are really amazing. Spiders spin webs out of hundreds and hundreds of miles of thread, and they make all kinds of patterns. And not one web is the same as another. Isn't it amazing?
It is amazing, Charlie. The webs sparkle in the rain.
And webs are really strong, Lola.
Whee!
Come on, Lola, jump!
And really bouncy! You mean one small teeny-weeny spider can make such a big, enormous web?
Shh, that's right. Spiders make them all the time. And if you brush a web away, they have to start all over again. Come here. Gotcha.
He is really rather special, isn't he? What do you think his name is?
What do you think it is?
Sydney.
He does look like a Sydney. How could you not like a spider called Sydney?
He's nice for a spider. Hello, Sydney.
Come on. Now we've got him, we've got to let him go. Let's take him outside. Would you like to set him free?
I won't drop him again, will I, Charlie?
No, Lola, you won't drop Sydney.
Bye, Sydney. Bye.
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 Come on, let's get in the warm.
Hop, hop, hop.
What's up, Lola?
It's very cold outside today.
Yes, it is.
I hope Sydney's all right. I know he's quite hairy, but he hasn't got a coat or socks.
Sydney will be fine, Lola.
What about if it rains? Sydney hasn't got an umbrella.
Spiders love the rain.
But what if there's a big flood and he's swooshed away? We've got to find him, Charlie.
What?
I think I might just bring him back in, just for a few minutes to warm up.
Oh.
Come on, Charlie. Sydney!
Sydney!
Sydney! Where are you?
Here's Sydney. He's not here, Lola.
He must be here somewhere. Sydney! Sydney!
We've searched everywhere, Lola.
We got to find him, Charlie. I know. You keep looking out here and I'll check the sink.
Sydney.
Oh, I wish you'd come back, Sydney. Sydney! Sydney! That's where you were. And Sydney, here's a little bed and a television, but it's not a real one. You can only watch one thing. And look, a little comb and mirror. I think you'll like it.
Hey, Lola, look. I found Sydney.
But so did I. There can't be two Sydneys, can there, Charlie? Your Sydney looks just like this Sydney.
Maybe they're brothers.
Of course. Sydney and Robert. Put him in the house, Charlie.
There we go.
Okay, Robert. And that's the bed. You can share it with Sydney. And over there's the television, but it's not a real one. And you can only watch one thing.
Lola, should we put them outside now?
Not now, Charlie. It's raining. Maybe after we've all had a spider tea party.
I don't know.
Now, Robert, you hold the mirror while Sydney brushes his legs.